Hello, I'm Bobby Gaines. I'm a graduate student at the University of Alabama, working on my master's in financial planning, and I conducted a review of literature involving student loans and rising tuition rates, and I wanted to share with you some of the information that I discovered, along with a proposal that I developed that may ease some of the student debt loan crisis that may be accumulating in our country today. MarketWatch has a student debt clock similar to the national debt clock that we've seen that actually calculates on real time an estimated amount of the total outstanding student loan debt in the United States. As of the time of my research, this is March 31st, 2017, the amount of outstanding student loan debt, according to the student debt clock, was $1,336,384,992,301. That's a lot. And it's increasing at a rate of $2,667.20 per second. Is student loan debt the next crisis in our country? Is it similar to the mortgage crisis of 2008? A lot of people think so. We are hearing a lot in the news and media that this is the next crisis that is facing our country. Not only is student debt rising, but college tuition is skyrocketing as well. Matter of fact, from 2006 to 2017, tuition at public four-year universities increased at a rate that was 3.5% above the rate of inflation. So it's going up as well. So I started thinking, is the ease of access to student loans the major contributing factor to rising tuition? Or is it that the mounting student loan debt is causing tuition to go up? I don't know. That's why I did the research. But the other question that I wanted to pose is mounting student loan debt, is it posing a risk to the American economy? Back in the 1970s, around 1978, student loans become much more widely available in the United States. And as early as 1980, college tuition began to consistently rise at a pace greater than the inflation rate. So that is the paradox. Are increasing tuition rates causing there to be more student loan debt, or is the increased amount of student loan debt causing the tuition to rise? So legislation led to a large credit expansion in student loans in our country, beginning with the 2007 and 2008 school year. And there are a lot of similarities between the student loan debt market and the housing market. And we all remember the housing crisis that started in 2008. So there's a lot of similarities between the housing market and the student loan and college financing markets. First of all, credit plays a significant role in both. Of course, most people don't pay cash for their homes. They borrow to finance the purchase of a home and take out a mortgage. Same thing with college education. Students are borrowing on an increased basis in order to finance their college education. So that's one of the things that kind of lead us to believe that there are similarities between the two markets. And we had a kind of a housing crisis, and will we ultimately have a student debt crisis? So let's just play around with some of the similarities between the two. Now, one of the things that caused the housing crisis was the ease of access to mortgage financing back in the early 2000s and the relaxed restrictions on underwriting that contributed to the Great Recession of 2008. Now, prior to the mortgage crisis, leading up to that, the housing values were going up considerably, in large part due to the increased supply of leveraged dollars chasing those hard real estate assets. All right, so to the increase in leverage for the purchase of homes was a result of government-sponsored programs, because think about it, the government wants to encourage everyone to become a homeowner. So legislation was passed that made it easier to obtain mortgages. Kind of the same thing in the education markets with student loans. Kind of a little lax out there. Everybody that wants to go to school can get a student loan. Basically, you don't have to qualify with credit for. I mean, it's a lot of similarities between what happened in 2008 and what's happening now in the educational credit markets. Because we knew back in the 2000s, as it is today, part of the American dream is owning a home. That's desirable. And one would think that public policy that would contribute to making it easier for people to get a home would be a good thing. But what happened is it was so lax that people who were not credit worthy were actually taking on debt to obtain those mortgages. They didn't, they had maybe low credit scores, not a long time on the job. They just really weren't credit worthy, but we wanted to encourage home ownership. So that's kind of what led to the crisis there. Same thing with public policy affecting student loans and education. In our society, having a college education, well, that's a good thing. Everybody should go to college. That's what we hear. And thus, we are encouraging people to go. How do you pay for it? I don't have the money to pay for it. I can't get a scholarship. What do I do? Hey, borrow the money. It's available for you. So we encourage our students to borrow and take on debt to attain another one of the American dreams, the college education. And we also see that with that policy that we're increasing, we want people to go to college. We're seeing that with our high school graduates and the percentages of those that are entering college now. 68% of students graduating high school in 2014 enrolled in either a 2 or 4-year college the following fall. So that's 68%. That is an increase of 8 percentage points since 1990. Now, of those students that entered college in the 2010 cohort, only 54.8% of those completed their degree within 6 years. That includes part-time students and full-time students. So 54.8 completed it in 6 years. The assumption there, the remaining 45, 46% never completed the educational degree, but they took out the debt to pay for that. Now, can you imagine, let's go back to the home ownership comparison. Can you imagine that a homeowner has obtained a mortgage and now because of some unforeseen circumstances, they got to leave the home. They abandon the home, they can't pay for the home, they lost their job, whatever. They're leaving the home's going to be foreclosed, they're going to file bankruptcy, something. The homeowner no longer controls that asset, but he or she is still obligated to pay the mortgage obligation on that home. Now, what can happen? They can't pay it anymore. They're going to leave it, foreclosure. What happens? Well, the home is a hard asset. It's a real asset that can be liquidated by the lender, and the sales proceeds can be applied to the indebtedness. Okay? It's likely that a deficiency will remain, but if the lender goes after the previous or the original homeowner can file bankruptcy and potentially have that debt discharged under a Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Well, let's kind of consider and compare and contrast that with mortgage loan. With student debt loan. If person falls out of school, no longer pursuing that degree, it's kind of like losing the home. You're still obligated on that debt, student debt obligation. The only problem is there's no hard asset that we can sell or that we can liquidate to pay down that debt. And let's say that the former student that dropped out of college, well, let's say they file a Chapter 7 bankruptcy petition. Are they going to be able to discharge the student loan indebtedness? Well, in most cases they can. unless the bankruptcy judge were to determine that the student loan debt would impose an undue hardship on the debtor or the debtor's dependents. And that is sometimes very hard to prove. So not a huge probability that they're going to get that student indebtedness discharged. So let's also think of this college dropout, or hypothetical college dropout. They're out of school now, and perhaps they have a job where because they dropped out of college, maybe their earning potential isn't as much, but the debt remains. So they're not earning as much, but they're still having to pay that debt, and perhaps their future income potential, because of not completing the college degree, is limited. Now, what has happened in this instance with our hypothetical dropout? The American taxpayer has helped to contribute to the educational costs of an individual who did not complete their degree requirements. Now that individual has little incentive to pay that debt obligation, and now who has a diminished earnings capacity by which to pay the student loan debt. So it appears that the entire student loan process is not entirely efficient. Okay, I would even say that the college dropouts are hurting further future college students who are entering college that will complete college. And the reason is because of the demand for college. The college, it's a supply and demand thing. The tuition costs rise, and then that person drops out of college. Well, those increases are still there for the future college students. So there's some really good evidence here to suggest that this entire process is not entirely efficient. There have been some studies that have indicated that the effect of increased borrowing limits on student loans account for up to 40% of the tuition increases at four-year educational institutions between 1987 and 2010. Now, it seems like a noble policy that we would encourage everyone to go to college and to borrow to do it if necessary, because you would assume that there's going to be a reward in excess of the payments that they'll have to make back on that student loan. But such a policy, when evaluated as a whole, doesn't take into account the welfare effects on these student loan recipients, as well as the effects of increased student tuition rates for future college students. So credit expansion in the student loan industry has been found to increase college tuition rates paid by all students, okay, including those students that come even after people have dropped out of college. Now, when people are borrowing to pay for college, oftentimes they're not just borrowing the tuition and fees. They're borrowing the maximum amount available to them under the student loan program. And they may not even know that they don't have to borrow the maximum. So let's say tuition for a semester is $5,000 and available to the student maybe $9,000. So they're like, oh, $9,000, okay, I'll take the $9,000. Then I got $4,000. I can pay rent. I can buy groceries. I can go to parties. I can go to concerts. Not saying that all students do that, but you can imagine that the temptation to take the entire amount is there as well. So they're borrowing amounts far in excess, many times, of the amount of tuition and fees that are available. Also, let's talk about students who actually complete their degrees. Perhaps they have unrealistic earnings expectations. Coming out, everyone wants to start out at $50 or $60 or $70 or $80,000, and that may be their expectations. But once they complete their degree, and let's say they have a degree, and I'm not disparaging any degree out there, but a degree in dancing, okay? And there's not a lot of jobs for dance instructors. There's not a lot of jobs for choreographers, and all of a sudden they can't get a job. And here I've got a degree in ballroom dancing. And the demand is not out there for it. And so I'm not going to have an increased earning capacity to pay for the student loans that I needed and obtained to get my education. So unrealistic expectations out there. The students oftentimes may be forced to move in with their parents. I think the ironic thing about that is a student is now who's unable to have the income necessary to pay back their student loan debt, moves back in with a parent, the very person that encouraged them to pursue that college degree in the first place. Kind of ironic. Okay, let's talk about the election of 2016. We remember in the media hearing much speculation and debate in the 2016 presidential election about student loan debt. There have been politicians who have floated the ideas of loan forgiveness, and students became very excited about that. Oh yeah, I took out $100,000 loans. Can you imagine if I get to be forgiven of that entire $100,000? That was out there. And naturally, that got a lot of students with student loan debt very, very excited. Some have even suggested free tuition, free college tuition for everyone. Can you imagine a student? Let's take a hypothetical student who completed his undergraduate degree 10 years ago. He has struggled for the last 120 months to repay his student loans in a timely manner, and he just wrote the check to pay off his entire debt. And he's like, yes, I'm so excited. I paid it off. Hey, I'm going to take the family, the wife, the children. We're going out tonight to celebrate. We're going to, where would you go to celebrate? I'm trying to think of the restaurant, whatever restaurant you would like. Hey, we're going there to celebrate. And all of a sudden he gets home, getting ready for bed, flips on the TV. He finds out that the president just signed into law legislation forgiving all student debts, and further that all college students in the future, hey, you can go free of tuition. Well, there'd be a lot of people that would be happy because the student debt is extinguished, but there'd be a lot of people like our hypothetical person who was celebrating paying off their debt that would be very, very angry. So there's no real easy solutions that we see out there. Increasing student loan debt is increasing. Will it become a burden on our society as a whole? Everybody's kind of waiting to see. Maybe there's not enough financial literacy out there among college students. Maybe they don't know the impact that these student loans are going to have on their future. Indiana University did an interesting thing. They sent out letters to student loan recipients at the college who had high student loan levels. And they basically estimated the students' future monthly payments for their student loans, which I think may have been eye-opening to the students. And they noticed after sending those letters out that there was an 18% decrease in the amount of student loan borrowing for the next semester. Another thing that they also found was this. After sending those letters, those students signed up for more credits and took on less debt the following semester. So very, very interesting there at Indiana University. Montana State University also sent letters to their students with high levels of student loan debt and encouraged those students to seek financial counseling. The students who received letters borrowed 1/3 less the following semester. So there are some things to suggest, or evidence to suggest, that efforts on behalf of universities to make students aware of the future consequences of their debt having some positive effects on the amount that they're borrowing. Okay, so it would be prudent for universities to provide students with estimates regarding their future earnings potential in relation to their chosen field of study as well. Can you imagine? You're a history major. Okay, what are you going to do with a history major? Well, if there were some way to provide estimates of what a college history major might earn in a position related to history, whether it be teaching or whatever, to the student, and then compare that with the amount of the student loan payment that they can anticipate in the future. I think that would be eye-opening to students, not only to provide them with an estimate of their future student loan payment, but to provide them with an estimate, and it's just an estimate, of their future earnings. I think that would be a very, very positive thing for universities to do. Okay? And also, not only to provide this to students on a one-time basis, but actually to provide this information annually. Some have also suggested that bankruptcy reform should be implemented to make it easier for students to discharge their student loan indebtedness. I don't know if this is good public policy or not. I think if we were to make it easier for student loans to be discharged in bankruptcy, what we would see is the filing of a bankruptcy would almost be as ceremonial as the graduation ceremony itself. It'd be kind of a rite of passage. Hey, I just graduated from college. Yay! You know, I attended graduation, I went to the beach, I did whatever, and next month I'm filing bankruptcy to get rid of these student loans. And I think we'd see that on a increased basis. So I don't think that's a solution at all. Another common proposal is to limit the caps and put limits on the funds that students can borrow. And there are some limits out there, but you can borrow far in excess of the amount of tuition at many universities in our country. One of the things, after looking at all of the research out there that I found, I kind of came up with a suggestion. What if we allowed kind of free market forces of supply and demand to compete for those student loan funds? Okay, and here's what I mean by that. Let's just assume that it is determined, and I know what I'm about to propose may open a huge who does this. We're just brainstorming now. But can you imagine if in our society it was deemed that there was a shortage of nurses in the workforce? There's not enough nurses in the labor market. Processes could be implemented to make student loan availability more accessible to those students that were entering nursing programs. And the amount that the students entering nursing programs could borrow would be greater than the amount that could be borrowed by students in less needed programs. So I think that's an interesting thing, to allow something like that to the kind of a supply and demand force to enter the student loan market. The amounts that they could borrow could also be commensurate upon what their projected earnings would be for a nurse coming out of the program. So in other words, it's a needed program. Let's give them a little more access to the loans. Let's give them a little more than a student that's in a program that is not as desirable. I can hear people now, oh, that's terrible. I'm just saying, it's supply and demand. It's something that may work. And then let's look at the earnings potential of a nurse and see if they would have an ability to make that loan, and the amount that they could borrow kind of be tied to their earnings potential. Now, I'm not suggesting that loans not be available to students in other fields. I'm not saying that at all, but I am saying that if it is if they're going into a program that is not as needed in our society, that perhaps the amount that they borrow is not as much. I mean, there's an amount that they can borrow, kind of a standard amount for everyone, but if it's not one of those required, necessary, shortage type fields that the amount that they borrow is not as much. Little supply and demand there. Then I would further incentivize student completion of their program and entrance into the nursing profession by giving a amount or a percentage of student loan forgiveness for each year that our hypothetical nursing student actually works in the nursing field. Where's the forgiveness coming from? Is it going to be the government just forgiving her loan because now we have a... No. What I would propose is that tax policies would be put in place to provide the employer of our hypothetical nurse to actually pay down part of his or her student loan indebtedness. So there's a incentive program for the employer to pay that down. Now, such a program may be or such a policy may be controversial. I understand that, but I think that it would produce a number of desired results. First, students would be encouraged to enter and to remain in a profession that is in a high demand in the labor market. So that's a good thing. Second, universities, educational institutions would be encouraged to invest in those programs to meet the increasing demands in the workforce. So you may be building new nursing research centers, new hospitals, things to train the nurses, because there'll be increased resources through student loans for students entering those programs. Third, the employers would be encouraged through tax incentives to pay the student loans of those most desired workers, which would also help to fill the gap in the supply of workers in those professions. Fourth, the labor market would receive an increased supply of workers in these critical areas to meet the demand. And finally, because of the limits on the availability and maximum amounts that could be borrowed by students entering those non-essential fields, the rapid rise in tuition costs possibly could be reduced and brought in line with the overall level of inflation, making the cost of a college education more affordable to all students. So that's the research that I did. That's the proposal that I'm just floating out there for comment. And thanks for watching. Again, my name is Bobby Gaines, and have a great day.